Victor Harrington stood frozen in the doorway, watching, as Olivia slipped the $100 bill back into his wallet before carefully closing the safe. But what paralyzed him wasn't that she'd touched his money, it was the note she left behind. "Mr. Harrington dropped this. Return in morning. Don't wake, needs sleep." Before we dive into this powerful story about trust, prejudice, and redemption, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If you believe in the power of honesty and integrity to change hearts, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel right now. This incredible journey shows how one small moment of pure innocence can crack open even the most cynical heart. Are you ready to see how a simple act from a child can transform a bitter billionaire's entire worldview? Let's begin. Victor Harrington's Italian leather shoes clicked against the imported marble floors of his 20-room mansion, the sound echoing through cavernous spaces designed more to impress than comfort. At 58, the tech mogul had achieved what society defined as the pinnacle of success, a net worth of $4.7 billion, a sprawling estate in Westfield Estates, the most exclusive gated community in the city, and Bagreed, the power to make or break companies with a single phone call. The mansion itself was a monument to wealth accumulation rather than a home east wing, housing his collection of rare art insured for hundreds of millions, 12-car garage, featuring vintage Ferraris and Aston Martins, arranged chronologically private helicopter pad for quick trips to his downtown office, and both indoor and outdoor pools that staff maintained meticulously despite Victor rarely entering the water. His salt and pepper hair was cut with precision every 2 weeks. His bespoke suits cost more than most people's cars, and his personal chef prepared meals that adhered strictly to his nutritionist's guidelines for longevity. By every material measure, Victor Harrington had won at life. Yet the man who moved through these opulent spaces had grown colder with each zero added to his bank accounts. His journey from upper-middle-class suburbs to tech billionaire had required ruthlessness that eventually became his defining characteristic. Early in his career, he'd discovered that hostile takeovers of promising startups yielded better returns than building something himself. Competitors who wouldn't sell were systematically undermined until their market value plummeted, and Victor could acquire them for pennies on the dollar. Former partners who challenged his decisions found themselves blacklisted throughout the industry. The press had dubbed him the Vulture of Silicon Valley, a nickname he privately considered a compliment to his business acumen. The success had come with profound personal costs. 3 failed marriages had left him with alimony payments he barely noticed, and relationships with his adult children that consisted primarily of perfunctory birthday calls and occasional requests for money. Friends had gradually fallen away as Victor's suspicion grew alongside his wealth. Every invitation scrutinized for hidden agendas, every compliment analyzed for manipulation. Eventually, his inner circle had contracted to paid staff and business associates who knew better than to cross him. The final blow to whatever remained of Victor's capacity for trust had come 6 months earlier. Richard Kensington, his CFO and last remaining friend from college days, had orchestrated an elaborate embezzlement scheme, siphoning nearly $30 million before disappearing to a country without extradition. The betrayal wasn't about the money. $30 million was barely noticeable in Victor's accounts. What had shattered him was that Richard had been the one person he'd still trusted implicitly, the only individual with whom he occasionally dropped the calculating facade. They'd vacationed together, shared confidences, stood as best men at each other's weddings. The night he'd discovered the betrayal, Victor had sat alone in his home theater with a 30-year-old Scotch, watching security footage of Richard accessing restricted accounts. He'd studied his friend's familiar face, searching for signs of the deception that must have been there all along. By morning, something fundamental had calcified inside him, the absolute certainty that humanity itself was fundamentally corrupt. Since that day, Victor had implemented increasingly paranoid security measures throughout his properties. Staff found previously accessible areas suddenly restricted their movements, monitored by additional cameras. Long-term employees with spotless records were subjected to random security checks and loyalty tests. cash left visible to see if it disappeared, fake confidential documents positioned to detect information leaks. Most of his staff had passed these tests, but Victor interpreted this not as evidence of their honesty, but as proof they hadn't yet found the right opportunity or price. His particular focus had recently turned to Esther Williams, his 54-year-old black housekeeper, who had maintained his home meticulously for 15 years. Despite her impeccable record, Victor found himself watching her more closely, questioning her movements through the house, harboring suspicions he couldn't logically justify, but felt instinctively, a bias he wouldn't acknowledge, even to himself. When Esther had requested permission for her daughter and granddaughter to stay temporarily in the staff quarters while their apartment underwent black mold remediation, Victor's immediate internal response had been suspicion. More people in his house meant more potential for theft, more unknown variables, more risk. He'd reluctantly agreed only because finding and training a replacement housekeeper would be inconvenient. The arrival of Gabrielle "Gabby" Williams and her 10-year-old daughter Olivia had disrupted the controlled environment Victor preferred. Footsteps in unexpected places, childish laughter carrying through otherwise silent corridors, the sense of being watched by curious eyes, all of it grated against his carefully maintained isolation. His first brief interaction with Olivia had occurred in the kitchen, where he'd found her reading at the table while Esther prepared his lunch. The child had immediately stood, offering a polite, "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrington," before gathering her books to leave. He'd acknowledged her with only a curt nod, but something about her had lingered in his thoughts afterward, perhaps the contrast between her careful politeness and his cold dismissal. That evening, sequestered in his study with financial reports, Victor had found his thoughts returning to the Williams family. In his experience, people living in subsidized housing with limited financial resources would inevitably be tempted by the wealth surrounding them in his home. It wasn't personal. It was human nature. People took advantage when opportunity presented itself. Richard had proven that even those with wealth and privilege would steal given the chance. How much more likely would someone struggling financially be to rationalize taking something from a man who wouldn't even notice the loss? The thought had crystallized into a plan. Another test similar to those he'd conducted with staff, but targeted specifically at Gabby Williams. He would create an opportunity too tempting to resist, then document the inevitable theft as justification for removing the family from his home. Victor's lips had curled into a humorless smile as he refined the details. He would leave his office safe conspicuously open with cash visible inside, then pretend to fall asleep on the nearby couch. When Gabby came to clean the office, he would watch through barely opened eyes as she faced temptation. The certainty of what would follow satisfied something dark and vindictive within him, further proof that his cynicism was merely realism, that trust was for fools who hadn't yet been betrayed thoroughly enough. Esther Williams had weathered many storms during her 64 years of life. Widowed, when Gabby was only 8, she had raised her daughter alone while working multiple cleaning jobs, ensuring that the grief of losing her husband never became an excuse for giving anything less than her best. For 15 years, she had maintained Victor Harrington's immense home with the same meticulous care she'd once applied to the 3-room apartment where she'd raised Gabby. The marble floors gleamed because she buffed them by hand, rather than using the mechanical polisher that might have saved her aching knees. The antique furniture in rarely used rooms remained dust-free because she cleaned each piece as if the owner might inspect it daily, though Victor barely noticed the spaces he owned. During her years in the Harrington mansion, Esther had observed the gradual hardening of her employer, the 3 wives who had come and gone, the children who visited less frequently until they stopped coming altogether, the increasing isolation and suspicion. She had weathered his implicit bias with dignified professionalism, ignoring the way he watched her when valuable items were nearby, pretending not to notice when he counted the silver after dinner parties or checked his office after she would not cleaned it. When the building inspector had condemned her daughter's apartment building due to toxic black mold, Esther had approached Victor with careful deference, presenting her request as temporary and assuring him that her family would be no inconvenience. His reluctant agreement had come with unspoken conditions, made clear through security cameras, suddenly activated in corridors, leading to staff quarters and new restrictions about which parts of the house they could access. Esther had accepted these indignities without comment, focusing instead on creating a safe temporary haven for her daughter and granddaughter. Gabrielle "Gabby" Williams had inherited her mother's strength and added her own fierce determination. At 34, she had overcome significant obstacles to become a registered nurse, working full-time in the oncology ward at City General while raising Olivia alone after her husband abandoned them when their daughter was just 2 years old. Despite her nursing credentials, Gabby struggled financially. Her salary at the public hospital barely covered rent, childcare, and student loan payments, leaving little for savings or emergencies. When black mold had been discovered throughout her apartment building, the temporary relocation to her mother's workplace had been both blessing and humiliation. Living in the servants' quarters of a billionaire's mansion while unable to afford even basic remediation for her own apartment highlighted the extreme inequality she navigated daily. Gabby felt the weight of her mother's sacrifices and worried that their presence might jeopardize the job Esther had held for 15 years. The contrast between their circumstances and the opulence surrounding them wasn't lost on Gabby, who carefully instructed Olivia about appropriate behavior. Remain in designated areas, speak only when spoken to leave no trace of their circumstances. Presence. Each morning, Gabby left before dawn for her hospital shift, dressed in scrubs, washed and pressed, the night before her nurse's ID badge, a hard-won symbol of professional accomplishment despite the systemic barriers she'd faced. 10-year-old Olivia had absorbed the resilience of both her grandmother and mother, developing a maturity beyond her years, while maintaining the wonder and curiosity natural to childhood. Her initial awe at the mansion's grandeur, rooms larger than their entire apartment artwork she recognized from history books, a library with more volumes than she could read in a lifetime, had quickly given way to practical observation of her surroundings. She noticed how her grandmother moved efficiently through spaces designed to impress rather than function, how the owner of all this wealth seemed perpetually unhappy, despite having everything money could buy, how certain rooms felt unlived in, despite their beauty. Olivia spent her days completing homeschool assignments at the kitchen table, while her grandmother worked careful to keep her books and materials contained to the space they'd been permitted to use. She read voraciously, currently making her way through a collection of classic novels she'd discovered in the staff break room left behind by previous employees. The Williams family had quickly established a careful routine in their temporary home. Esther maintained her usual duties while discreetly ensuring Olivia had appropriate supervision. Gabby worked double shifts when possible to accumulate extra funds for securing a new apartment once their building was habitable again. Olivia divided her time between schoolwork and helping her grandmother with appropriate tasks, learning the value of invisible labor that maintained spaces others took for granted. Throughout it all, Victor Harrington observed them through security feeds and calculated surveillance. His attention focused particularly on Gabby, whom he assessed with the same cold analysis he applied to potential acquisitions. He noted her late returns from the hospital, interpreting her exhaustion as resentment, her careful avoidance of restricted areas as suspiciously deliberate rather than respectful compliance. Despite himself, Victor had noticed Olivia's behavior with reluctant approval. Her books were advanced for her age, her manners impeccable, her presence unexpectedly unobtrusive for a child. This observation only intensified his suspicion of Gabby. Clearly, the child had been carefully coached to create a favorable impression while the adults implemented whatever scheme they'd devised. "I want additional monitoring on the Williams woman and her daughter Victor," instructed his head of security, a retired police officer named Jensen, who managed the property's extensive surveillance system. "Especially when they're near my personal quarters or office." Jensen had frowned slightly, an expression quickly masked by professional neutrality. "The housekeeper's family, sir. We haven't observed any concerning behavior from either of them." "That's because they haven't found the right opportunity yet," Victor had replied, dismissing Jensen's implied objection. "Everyone has a price or a justification. It's just a matter of what and when." The security head had nodded without further comment, but his discomfort with monitoring a child was evident in his posture. Victor dismissed this as sentimentality, another weakness he'd purged from his own character through decades of business warfare. Over the following days, Victor refined his plan while maintaining careful distance from the family. He reviewed security footage each evening, searching for evidence to confirm his suspicions. Moments of Gabby or Olivia looking too long at valuable items, testing doors to restricted areas, exhibiting any behavior that might justify his predetermined conclusion. When no such evidence materialized, he interpreted this as proof of careful planning rather than innocence. The opportunity to implement his test came on a Thursday evening when Gabby was scheduled for a night shift at the hospital. Victor instructed the housekeeping staff to leave his office untouched, claiming important papers that shouldn't be disturbed. After dinner, he methodically prepared the scene, opening his wall safe just enough to reveal stacks of cash, expensive watches, and jewelry clearly visible inside. He positioned his leather couch to allow optimal observation of both the safe and door while appearing casual as if he'd simply fallen asleep while working. A tumbler of scotch and open laptop on the adjacent coffee table completed the tableau. As the mansion quieted for the evening, Victor settled onto the couch, a throw blanket arranged haphazardly across his legs. His eyes remained open just enough to monitor the room through his lashes, his breathing deliberately deep and regular. His expectation was that Gabby would check his office before leaving for her shift, finding an irresistible opportunity in the apparently sleeping billionaire and open safe. Instead, the hours passed in silence, the mansion settling into its nighttime rhythms around him. Victor maintained his position with the discipline that had built his empire, ignoring the growing discomfort in his back and the tedium of waiting. Shortly after 9, soft footsteps approached his office door, lighter than an adult's, hesitant rather than purposeful. Victor maintained his feigned sleep as the door eased open just enough to admit a small figure carrying something in both hands. To his surprise, it was Olivia rather than Gabby who entered the room, a glass of water balanced carefully between her palms. Olivia stepped cautiously into the vast office, trying not to spill the water her grandmother had asked her to deliver before Mr. Harrington retired for the evening. The crystal glass felt fragile and expensive between her small hands, another reminder that everything in this house required special care and attention. She'd never been in this particular room before. Her grandmother had strict rules about which spaces were appropriate for her to enter, but Esther had made an exception since Mr. Harrington had specifically requested water before bed. The office impressed her with its grandeur, ceiling-high bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that appeared untouched, an enormous mahogany desk positioned to oversee the manicured grounds visible through floor-to-ceiling windows, oil paintings, in ornate frames, depicting landscapes she didn't recognize. Everything spoke of wealth, so casual it didn't need acknowledgement power, so complete it required no demonstration. Olivia noticed Mr. Harrington asleep on the leather couch before she'd taken 3 steps into the room. She froze immediately, unsure of proper protocol. Her grandmother hadn't prepared her for finding him asleep. Should she wake him to deliver the water, leave it silently and retreat, return with the water later? The sleeping billionaire looked unexpectedly vulnerable, his normally stern face relaxed in slumber, one arm dangling toward the floor. He seemed older in sleep, the lines around his eyes deeper, his carefully maintained appearance slightly disheveled. Deciding that disturbing his rest would be impolite, Olivia moved quietly toward the desk, intending to leave the water with a respectful note explaining its presence. As she carefully placed the glass on a coaster, her grandmother had been very clear about always using coasters on wooden surfaces. Olivia noticed something unusual from the corner of her eye. An open safe in the wall behind the desk, its door ajar enough to reveal stacks of cash and glittering objects inside. Through barely open eyes, Victor watched the child approach his desk with the water glass, noting her careful placement on a coaster rather than directly on the wood. Her unexpected consideration for his property registered briefly before his attention shifted to her discovery of the safe. This was the moment of truth. The temptation he'd deliberately created now presented to an unexpected subject. He observed with clinical detachment as Olivia noticed the open safe, anticipating her inevitable succumbing to temptation. Instead, the girl simply stood looking at the safe's contents without making any move to approach it. Her expression showed curiosity but not covetousness, interest without calculation. Victor maintained his steady breathing while his mind reassessed the scenario. Perhaps she was simply more cautious than he'd anticipated, concerned about being observed. His expectations shifted again as Olivia's attention moved to something on the floor near the safe. She took a few steps closer, then knelt down to examine what Victor realized must be a $100 bill he'd deliberately dropped as additional temptation. Now came the critical moment. The child was alone, believed herself unwatched, and held valuable property that could be easily concealed. Victor felt a grim satisfaction as she picked up the money, anticipating the confirmation of his worldview. What happened next shattered his expectations completely. Instead of pocketing the bill, Olivia carried it to the desk and found a notepad nearby. She wrote something carefully, then placed the $100 bill on the desk with the note visibly attached. Victor could just make out the childish handwriting. Mr. Harrington dropped this. "Return in morning. Don't wake. Needs sleep." The simple message struck him with unexpected force. Not only had she resisted taking money that could have disappeared without trace, but she documented finding it and expressed concern for his rest. The behavior so contradicted his expectations that Victor nearly revealed his wakefulness in shock. Olivia returned to the water glass, adjusting the coaster slightly to ensure it was centered properly. She took one last look around the room, her gaze lingering momentarily on the sleeping billionaire, then quietly retreated, pulling the door gently closed behind her. Victor remained motionless long after her departure, mind racing to incorporate this unexpected data point into his understanding of human nature. Perhaps this had been an elaborate performance, knowing he might be watching. But the child's actions had carried no theatrical quality, no looking around for cameras or checking to see if he was truly asleep. The natural simplicity of her honesty had an authenticity that even his cynicism couldn't dismiss. Despite his intention to maintain the charade until Gabby appeared for her presumed attempt at theft, Victor eventually drifted into genuine sleep, the comfortable security of his wealth and the lingering warmth of the child's unexpected integrity, creating a rare moment of peace. He awoke hours later, neck stiff from his awkward position, to find the mansion quiet around him. The $100 bill remained on his desk, with the note exactly as Olivia had left it. Nothing in the safe had been disturbed. Checking his watch, Victor realized it was after midnight. Gabby would have left for her hospital shift hours ago. Disoriented by both physical discomfort and cognitive dissonance, he rose stiffly and approached his desk. The child's handwriting looked even more innocent in the dim light. No calculation, no manipulation, just simple, honest communication. Victor found himself touching the note with unusual gentleness, as if it represented something fragile and precious. Still unsatisfied and unwilling to abandon his suspicions entirely, Victor accessed the security system through his phone, reviewing footage from the hours he'd been asleep. The cameras showed Olivia returning to the kitchen and informing her grandmother that she'd left water for Mr. Harrington but hadn't wakened him. Later footage captured Gabby preparing for her shift, kissing Olivia goodnight, and leaving the mansion without approaching his office. The morning footage showed Olivia telling her mother about finding the money at breakfast, with Gabby's immediate response being clear instruction. "We need to make sure Mr. Harrington gets that back right away." Nothing in any of the footage supported his assumption of dishonesty or attempted theft. Victor stood in his office, the $100 bill in his hand, experiencing an unfamiliar sensation, the discomfort of having one's fundamental beliefs challenged by irrefutable evidence. With uncharacteristic uncertainty, he returned the money to his safe and closed it securely. His test, having yielded results he had neither anticipated nor knew how to interpret. Comment number 1. If you've ever been surprised by someone's honesty when they could have easily taken advantage of a situation. We often expect the worst from people, but sometimes their integrity shines through in the most unexpected ways. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe children often have the purest moral compass before the world teaches them otherwise. Have you ever misjudged someone based on stereotypes or preconceptions? What happened when you realized your mistake? Let's see how Victor's encounter with young Olivia begins to crack the walls of distrust he's built around himself and challenges the cynical worldview that has defined his existence for decades. Will this single moment of unexpected honesty be enough to change a man hardened by betrayal and wealth, or will his suspicions find new ways to explain away this inconvenient evidence of human goodness? Over the next several days, Victor found himself increasingly preoccupied with Olivia's act of honesty. The child's simple integrity had created a splinter in his carefully constructed worldview, small but persistently irritating, impossible to ignore completely. He found himself observing the Williams family with new attention, not just through security cameras, but in person, lingering in spaces where he could overhear their interactions without being obvious about his interest. What he witnessed challenged his assumptions further. Esther continued her duties with the same quiet efficiency she had demonstrated for 15 years, neither seeking recognition nor attempting to curry favor through her work. When she believed herself alone, her standards remained identical to when under direct supervision, a consistency that couldn't be explained by fear of being caught. In the evenings, when Gabby returned from her hospital shifts, Victor observed her helping Olivia with homework at the kitchen table. Despite obvious exhaustion, the mother displayed remarkable patience and knowledge, guiding her daughter through mathematics problems and helping her analyze the themes in her reading assignments. Their interactions revealed none of the resentment or envy he had assumed they must feel toward his wealth. Instead, they displayed genuine gratitude for the temporary sanctuary of the staff quarters and respect for the space they occupied. Most confounding was Olivia herself, whose behavior remained consistently thoughtful and considerate, regardless of whether adults were present. Security footage showed her tidying her belongings without being asked, carefully treating the borrowed books she read, and even attempting to help with simple household tasks, despite her grandmother's gentle insistence that such work wasn't her responsibility. Unable to reconcile these observations with his conviction that everyone had a price, Victor created additional tests, leaving his wallet visible on a hallway table, positioning expensive jewelry on bathroom counters near the staff quarters, placing electronics in common areas where they could easily disappear. Nothing was ever taken. Each test that failed to confirm his bias increased his frustration rather than his trust, creating cognitive dissonance he struggled to resolve. "You seem preoccupied lately, sir," observed Malcolm, his longtime driver, and one of the few employees Victor had retained for over a decade. They were returning from a downtown meeting, Victor unusually quiet in the back seat of the Bentley. "Anything I can help with?" The question, offered with genuine concern rather than obligation, broke through Victor's rumination. "Tell me, Malcolm, do you believe people are fundamentally honest, or do they simply wait for safe opportunities to take advantage?" Malcolm considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I believe most people try to do right when they can, sir, though circumstances sometimes make that harder for some than others. Even when significant gain is possible. When they could take something valuable with virtually no chance of consequences," Victor pressed, thinking of the open safe and Olivia's response. "Perhaps especially then, sir. Character is revealed most clearly when no one's watching." The echo of Victor's own father's words from decades earlier created another moment of unexpected resonance. Malcolm continued thoughtfully, "May I speak candidly, sir?" At Victor's nod, he added, "Is this about Miss Williams' family staying in the staff quarters?" Because in 15 years, Esther has never given anyone reason to question her integrity. The perceptiveness of the observation irritated Victor. "It's about Richard," he deflected. "His betrayal has made me question my judgment of character generally." "With respect, sir, allowing one person's betrayal to color your view of everyone else isn't sound judgment, it's fear." The bluntness of Malcolm's response triggered immediate defensiveness. "Richard was my friend for 30 years. If he could betray me after all that time and shared history, how can I trust people I barely know, who have far more reason to resent me?" Malcolm seemed to weigh his next words carefully. "Perhaps the question isn't whether others can be trusted, but what happens to us when we assume they can't be. Suspicion becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy eventually. We see what we're looking for, even when it isn't there. The philosophical turn irritated Victor further. I'm looking for evidence. Malcolm, not confirmation of my assumptions. I've been testing the Williams family just as I test all my staff. The admission escaped before he could censor himself. Malcolm's expression shifted subtly, disappointment evident despite his professional restraint. Testing them, how exactly? The quiet disapproval in the question made Victor uncomfortable in a way few things could anymore. Simple opportunity tests. Nothing that would entrap anyone not already inclined to steal. The defensiveness in his own voice sounded hollow even to his ears. Including the child you've been testing, a 10-year-old girl, Malcolm's question carried no judgment in its words, but unmistakable censure in its tone. She was an unexpected variable in one test, Victor admitted reluctantly. She found money I'd left visible while pretending to sleep. Malcolm waited clearly, expecting more. She returned it. With a note expressing concern that I needed rest, Victor finally added the words, feeling like a concession. And this surprised you? It wasn't a question, but an observation. It contradicted my expectations. Victor acknowledged stiffly. Perhaps the problem isn't with their trustworthiness, but with your expectations, Malcolm suggested quietly. With respect, sir, wealth does many things, but it shouldn't disconnect us from our humanity. Children like Olivia haven't yet learned to be anything but themselves. Their actions show us who they really are, not who they think we want them to be. The conversation had strayed too far into personal territory for Victor's comfort. That's enough philosophical discussion for one day, Malcolm. I have work to review before my next meeting. The dismissal was clear, and Malcolm respected it, returning his attention to driving. But the conversation lingered in Victor's thoughts as they completed the journey in silence. That night, Victor found himself unable to sleep, Malcolm's words echoing uncomfortably in his mind. Standing at his bedroom window, overlooking the vast grounds of his estate, he found himself remembering his own childhood, not the privileged upbringing many assumed he'd had, but the middle-class neighborhood where his father had worked as an accountant, and his mother had taught elementary school. They had lived comfortably, but modestly. Their values centered on education, integrity, and hard work, rather than accumulation of wealth. His father's oft-repeated wisdom about character being what you do when no one is watching had once been Victor's own guiding principle before ambition, and opportunity had gradually eroded his moral foundations. When had accumulation replaced purpose? When had suspicion replaced discernment? The questions were uncomfortable enough that Victor deliberately redirected his thoughts to more familiar territory, strategy and testing. If the Williams family had passed his initial tests, perhaps what was needed was a more substantial challenge, something that would reveal their true nature beyond any doubt. The following morning, he placed an envelope containing $10,000 in cash on the kitchen counter with a note indicating it was for household expenses. He then monitored the security feed from his office, watching as Esther discovered the envelope during her morning routine. Her immediate reaction was visible confusion, followed by concern. Without hesitation, she picked up the house phone and called Victor's personal assistant. "This is Esther Williams in the kitchen. There's an envelope with what appears to be a significant amount of cash left on the counter with Mr. Harrington's handwriting. Could you please confirm whether he intended to leave this here? It seems unusual, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't left by mistake." The complete absence of any attempt to conceal, pocket, or otherwise take advantage of the cash created yet another fracture in Victor's cynical expectations. The assistant, unaware of the test, checked with Victor directly. "Mr. Harrington, Esther found an envelope of cash in the kitchen and wants to confirm your intentions. Should I tell her it was meant for household expenses, as the note indicates, too?" The direct confrontation with his own manipulative behavior made Victor unusually uncomfortable. "Yes, tell her that's correct," he responded curtly, ending the call before the assistant could question this departure from normal procedure. The repeated failure of his tests was becoming more irritating than reassuring, challenging assumptions, so deeply held he barely recognized them as beliefs rather than facts. Increasingly unsettled by the cognitive dissonance, Victor decided to interact more directly with the Williams family, convinced that closer observation would reveal the flaws and ulterior motives his tests had somehow failed to expose. That evening he did something he had never done in 15 years. He joined the household staff for dinner in the kitchen rather than eating alone in his dining room. The surprised silence that greeted his appearance spoke volumes about how unusual this behavior was. Esther recovered first her professionalism, masking whatever questions she might have had. "Good evening, Mr. Harrington. Would you like me to serve your dinner in the dining room as usual?" "No, I thought I'd eat here tonight," he replied, taking a seat at the kitchen table where Olivia had been working on a science assignment. The child quickly gathered her papers, making room with the assumption she should leave. "You don't need to go." Victor found himself saying the words surprising him as much as the girl. "What are you studying?" The simple question opened an unexpectedly genuine conversation with Olivia, explaining her astronomy unit with enthusiasm that gradually overcame her initial caution. Victor found himself engaged, despite himself impressed by the child's knowledge and thoughtful questions. When Gabby arrived partway through dinner, still in her hospital, Scrubs' her momentary shock at finding her daughter in conversation with the billionaire was quickly masked by polite greeting. The undercurrent of tension was obvious, her protective instinct warring with the necessity of maintaining good relations with her mother's employer. Throughout the awkward meal, Victor observed their interactions with careful attention. Esther's quiet competence directing the household despite his unexpected presence. Gabby's dignified restraint despite clear exhaustion and discomfort. Olivia's natural curiosity repeatedly overcoming her careful manners as she asked questions about his business and travels. Nothing in their behavior suggested the resentment or envy he had assumed must exist. Instead, they displayed the unself-conscious authenticity of people who had nothing to hide and no agenda beyond surviving their circumstances with dignity intact. As the meal concluded, Victor noticed Olivia carefully wrapping half her dessert in a napkin. "Are you saving that for later?" he asked, curious about this unexpected behavior. For Mom, Olivia explained simply, "She'll be hungry when she gets home from night shift, and this is her favorite." The small gesture of consideration, a child thinking about her mother's needs hours in advance, created another moment of unexpected resonance. Looking more carefully at the textbooks Olivia had been using, Victor noticed their worn condition and outdated publication dates. Despite the family's evident intelligence and commitment to education, their resources were clearly limited. Library books supplemented by second-hand textbooks, pencils used down to stubs before replacement notebooks filled completely, before new ones were purchased. The contrast between their careful management of limited resources and his own casual wealth created an uncomfortable awareness he couldn't easily dismiss. As he returned to his private quarters that evening, Victor found himself experiencing an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. Genuine respect for people who had every reason to resent him, but chose dignity and integrity instead. The feeling was so unfamiliar that he initially struggled to identify it, mistaking it for some variant of pity or condescension before recognizing its true nature. This recognition didn't immediately transform his fundamental worldview, but it created the first significant crack in decades of calcified cynicism, a small opening through which uncomfortable questions about his own choices began to emerge. The following week brought a shift in Victor's approach, from testing the Williams family to investigating them from curiosity rather than suspicion. Using the same resources he typically employed for business acquisitions and competitor research, he began examining Gabrielle Williams' professional life with unexpected interest. His initial searches revealed that she worked in the oncology ward at City General, the public hospital serving primarily low-income residents without private insurance. Further investigation showed she had graduated with honors from her nursing program despite working full-time throughout her education. Most surprising was the discovery that she had turned down 3 offers from prestigious private hospitals where her salary would have nearly doubled, choosing instead to remain at the chronically underfunded public institution where she had started as a nursing assistant years earlier. This choice contradicted everything Victor understood about rational economic behavior. In his experience, people invariably maximized personal gain when opportunities presented themselves. Gabby's decision to remain in a position with higher stress, lower compensation, and more difficult working conditions made no sense within his framework of human motivation. Seeking to understand this apparent anomaly, Victor arranged lunch with his personal physician, Dr. Keller, a connection that would allow him to inquire about nursing at City General without revealing his specific interest. The conditions there are challenging, to put it mildly. Dr. Keller explained when Victor casually raised the topic. Outdated equipment, constant supply shortages, overwhelming patient loads. It's healthcare at its most difficult. The nurses who stay do it because they're deeply committed to serving vulnerable populations. They could all make significantly more elsewhere with far less stress. That seems irrational. From a career perspective, Victor observed, genuinely puzzled by the choice. Dr. Keller smiled slightly. Not everything valuable can be measured in financial terms, Victor. The nurses at City General provide care to people who would otherwise have none. Many consider that meaningful enough to offset the financial disadvantages. The concept of prioritizing meaning over compensation was so foreign to Victor's worldview that he struggled to integrate it into his understanding of human motivation. His confusion deepened when he overheard a conversation between Esther and Olivia while passing the kitchen later that week. "Mom looks so tired when she comes home," Olivia was saying, concern evident in her young voice. "Miss Janice said her family would look after me yesterday so Mom could sleep, but she went back to the hospital instead. Your mother stays late sometimes to sit with patients who don't have family," Esther explained gently. "There was an elderly gentleman who received difficult news yesterday. She didn't want him to be alone. But she doesn't get paid extra for that, right?" Olivia asked, with the directness of childhood. "No, sweetheart. She does it because she believes everyone deserves compassion, especially in their hardest moments." Victor had continued walking, but the conversation lingered in his thoughts. Another data point that contradicted his assumptions about universal self-interest. Gabby wasn't just foregoing higher pay, but actively giving away her limited time without compensation, prioritizing a stranger's emotional needs above her own physical rest. The behavior made no sense within his framework of human motivation, but aligned perfectly with the integrity he had reluctantly observed in their family interactions. Increasingly intrigued by this puzzle of apparently genuine altruism, Victor decided to investigate the black mold situation that had forced the family to seek temporary housing in his staff quarters. The inquiry began as intellectual curiosity, but quickly transformed into something more uncomfortable. The apartment building was owned by Westside Properties, a management company that was itself a subsidiary of Harrington Capital Holdings, one of Victor's own investment vehicles. Further investigation revealed a disturbing pattern of neglect across multiple properties in his portfolio. Maintenance requests ignored inspections, falsified corners cut to maximize profit margins, while tenants lived with increasingly dangerous conditions. The black mold in Gabby's building had been reported 9 months earlier, but deemed non-priority maintenance by property managers, incentivized to minimize expenses. The realization that his own business practices had directly contributed to the Williams family's housing crisis created an unfamiliar feeling in Victor, something approximating guilt, an emotion he had efficiently excised from his prized emotional repertoire decades earlier. What had begun as an abstract exercise in understanding peculiar behavior had unexpectedly connected to real consequences for people he had come to reluctantly respect. This discomfort led to further investigation. A quiet inspection of the guest quarters where Gabby and Olivia were staying conducted while both were away. Unlike his previous surveillance, Victor approached this observation with genuine curiosity rather than suspicious scrutiny. The modest space was meticulously maintained with personal belongings carefully organized to occupy minimal space. Olivia's possessions were particularly revealing. Mostly books borrowed from libraries, well-worn clothing mended rather than replaced, and a single stuffed bear that showed signs of being repaired multiple times. A small desk in the corner held her schoolwork, the assignments revealing advanced reading levels and mathematical ability well beyond her grade. In a drawer, partially open, Victor noticed a stack of cards and certificates. Investigating further, he discovered they were thank-you notes from hospital patients and recognition awards Gabby had received for exceptional nursing care. The modesty with which these achievements were stored rather than displayed spoke to a humility completely foreign to Victor's experience. His unexpected meeting with Olivia in the mansion's library late that night seemed almost predestined after a day spent investigating her family. He had been reviewing acquisition documents when the door opened silently and the child appeared freezing in momentary alarm at finding the space occupied. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harrington. I didn't think anyone would be here this late. I can come back tomorrow." Her immediate accommodation to his presumed preferences reflected the careful awareness of power dynamics that children in precarious circumstances often develop. "You can stay," Victor found himself saying, gesturing to the vast collection surrounding them. "Were you looking for something specific?" Olivia hesitated before answering with careful honesty. "I finished all the books Grandma found for me. I thought maybe I could borrow one more before we have to leave next week." The reminder of their impending departure created an unexpected hollow feeling that Victor didn't immediately recognize. "What kinds of books do you enjoy?" he asked, setting aside his work with unusual willingness to be interrupted. The conversation that followed revealed Olivia's remarkable intelligence and curiosity, her interests spanning science, history, and literature far beyond typical 10-year-old reading levels. She spoke about astronomy with particular enthusiasm, explaining her dream of becoming a doctor to help people like Mommy does, but maybe also work with NASA someday, so astronauts can stay healthy in space. The specificity and ambition of her vision impressed Victor despite himself. "You seem very determined about your future," he observed. "Mom says education is how we change our circumstances." Olivia replied with the simple conviction of repeating an often heard family truth. "She had to work extra hard because she had me, but she never gave up on becoming a nurse." The child's awareness of her mother's sacrifices created another moment of unexpected resonance for Victor. After helping her select several books appropriate to her interests, he found himself asking the question that had lingered since their first encounter. "Olivia, may I ask you something? That night you found money near my safe. Why didn't you keep it? No one would have known." The question emerged with genuine curiosity rather than the gotcha tone of his usual interrogations. Olivia looked surprised at the question, as if the answer were self-evident. "It wasn't mine," she said simply. "Grandma says character is what you do when nobody's watching." The phrase, identical to his father's frequent wisdom and Malcolm's recent reminder, struck Victor with unexpected force. Before he could formulate a response, Olivia continued with innocent directness. "Is it nice to have so many rooms and nobody to share them with?" The question contained no judgment, but cut through decades of accumulated justification about wealth and success. Victor found himself answering with uncharacteristic honesty. "Not particularly, no." The admission surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Olivia, who nodded with the serious acceptance of childhood before gathering her selected books and bidding him good night. Alone in the vast library, Victor remained motionless, the child's innocent question echoing in his mind. He had spent decades accumulating wealth, power, and property while systematically eliminating meaningful connections. The emptiness of his grand mansion suddenly seemed less an expression of success and more evidence of profound failure, not in business, but in the fundamental human project of creating meaning and relationship. For the first time in years, Victor found himself examining old photographs stored in his desk. Images from before wealth had transformed him into someone his younger self would have despised. Pictures of college friendships based on genuine connection rather than utility. Early business partnerships built on shared vision rather than strategic advantage. The family he had prioritized below profit until they had eventually stopped seeking his attention altogether. The contrast between the hopeful young man in those photos and the isolated, suspicious person he had become created a moment of clarity so painful he physically recoiled from the images. The Williams family, struggling financially but rich, in mutual care, integrity, and purpose, had inadvertently held up a mirror that reflected his spiritual poverty in stark relief. Their integrity wasn't a naive weakness he could exploit, but a strength he had sacrificed in pursuit of wealth that ultimately served no purpose beyond its own accumulation. This realization didn't immediately transform Victor's character or erase decades of entrenched patterns, but it created the first authentic questioning he had allowed himself since ambition had replaced connection as his primary value. The businessman who had built an empire on strategic calculation found himself facing a balance sheet of a different kind, one where all his accumulated assets couldn't offset the bankruptcy of purpose and relationship that characterized his existence. The mansion's emergency alert system jolted Victor awake at 2:17 in the morning, a sound he hadn't heard since installation and testing years earlier. The security system showed movement in the staff quarters' unusual activity, registering on multiple sensors simultaneously. Checking the camera feed on his bedside tablet, he observed a scene of obvious distress. Esther moving frantically between rooms, phone pressed to her ear, unmistakable panic in her normally composed demeanor. Without conscious decision, Victor found himself pulling on a robe and heading toward the staff, wing something beyond curiosity, driving him to investigate personally rather than through digital surveillance. He arrived to find Esther outside Olivia's room, fear evident in her expression, as she spoke urgently into the phone. Her temperature's 104.3 Gabby. She's having trouble breathing, and I can't get it down with cool compresses. Victor's presence registered belatedly, Esther's eyes widening in momentary surprise before returning to her immediate concern. "I'm calling an ambulance," she told her daughter on the phone, "but it could be 20 minutes or more. You should meet us at the emergency room." Without the calculated deliberation that typically preceded his every action, Victor stepped forward. "My car is faster than waiting for an ambulance. And my personal physician can meet us at the hospital immediately." The offer emerged with instinctive immediacy that surprised him as much as it clearly surprised Esther. Her momentary hesitation reflected understandable wariness about his unexpected involvement, but Olivia's condition left no room for pride or suspicion. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." Her fever came on suddenly. She was fine at bedtime. The explanation came as Esther was already moving to gather necessities, her efficient crisis response, reflecting years of handling emergencies with limited resources. Victor found himself issuing directions to his driver and personal physician, simultaneously arranging resources with the same decisive efficiency he typically reserved for business operations. Within minutes, his seldom-used Bentley was brought around the back seat, hastily prepared to transport a seriously ill child. Victor's reaction to this medical emergency differed fundamentally from his typical response to unexpected situations. There was no calculation of advantage, no assessment of risk versus reward, no strategic positioning, only the basic human response to suffering that required immediate action. When Esther emerged carrying Olivia wrapped in a light blanket, the child's normally vibrant presence diminished by illness, something unfamiliar tightened in Victor's chest. The 10-year-old's labored breathing and flushed face triggered protective instincts he had thought. Long dormant residual humanity breaking through years of calculated detachment. The drive to City General Hospital passed in tense silence. Victor seated opposite Esther and Olivia, observing the grandmother's gentle care with growing awareness of his own emotional response. The sight of Olivia's small hand, clutching her grandmother's with fevered intensity, created resonance with his own childhood memories of illness and comfort. Human experiences his wealth had insulated him from, but never entirely erased. City General's emergency department presented a stark contrast to the private medical care Victor had arranged for himself for decades. The waiting room overflowed with patients of varied ages and conditions, harsh fluorescent lighting, illuminating expressions of pain, worry, and resignation. The noise level, coughing conversations, occasional crying, created a cacophony entirely unlike the hushed, orderly environments of exclusive medical facilities where staff outnumbered patients and comfort was prioritized alongside care. Victor's attempt to leverage his name for immediate attention yielded limited results until he specified his relationship to Dr. Anna Lifey. Eliza Keller, chief of cardiology at Manhattan Medical Center and consultant to several hospital boards. The mention of his personal physician's name and her immediate arrival transformed the staff's response, creating a prioritization that bypassed normal triage procedures. As Olivia was quickly assessed and taken to an examination room, Victor observed Esther's visible relief at the expedited care, while simultaneously noting her discomfort with receiving special treatment unavailable to others, waiting with equal need. This awareness of injustice, even in a moment of personal crisis, reflected a moral compass that made his own comfortable expectation of privilege seem suddenly hollow. Gabby's arrival, still wearing nursing scrubs from her interrupted shift, brought another dimension to the unfolding situation. Her professional composure visibly strained by maternal fear, she listened intently to the examining physician's assessment while maintaining physical contact with her daughter throughout. Severe pneumonia likely exacerbated by previous respiratory irritation, the doctor explained, referring to the black mold exposure without knowing its source. We need to admit her immediately for IV antibiotics and respiratory support. Victor observed the momentary flicker of anxiety that crossed Gabby's face at the mention of admission, the automatic mental calculation of costs and insurance coverage that intruded even in medical crisis for those without financial security. Before conscious deliberation, he found himself stating, "Don't worry about the cost. I'm taking care of it." The words emerged without strategic purpose, an impulsive response to human suffering rather than calculated generosity. Gabby's expression reflected complex emotions, gratitude wrestling with pride, necessity overriding independence. "That's very generous, but please," Victor interrupted with uncharacteristic awkwardness. "It's the least I can do." He didn't articulate the full truth, that his own company's negligence had contributed to the conditions that likely compromised Olivia's respiratory health. That recognition remained a private acknowledgement driving action, without requiring public confession. As Olivia was transferred to the pediatric ward, Victor found himself accompanying the family without clear purpose or intention. His presence neither requested nor rejected an unexpected participant in a crisis that would normally exist, entirely outside his insulated experience. The hours that followed provided an education in realities his wealth had allowed him to ignore. The understaffed hospital operating with limited resources, despite the dedicated professionals working within its constraints. The visible disparity between this facility serving predominantly lower-income patients and the private medical care he took for granted. The cramped waiting room where families from diverse backgrounds shared the universal experience of fear for loved ones' temporary community formed through shared vulnerability. Most revealing was witnessing Gabby's colleagues recognizing her not as a subordinate but as a respected peer, doctors consulting her professional opinion despite her role as mother. In this situation, nurses offering support that reflected genuine relationship rather than hierarchical obligation. The night spent in uncomfortable waiting room chairs, Victor declining multiple suggestions that he could return home while they waited, created an unexpected equalizing of experience. For perhaps the first time in decades, the billionaire found himself in a situation where his wealth provided limited advantage, where he experienced the same physical discomfort and emotional uncertainty as those around him. The enforced waiting created space for observation and reflection impossible in his typically controlled environment. He noticed how Esther maintained dignity despite exhaustion, how hospital staff acknowledged Gabby with obvious respect, despite her current vulnerability, how the community of waiting families shared resources and comfort across differences of language, culture, and circumstance. Most significantly, he observed his own internal responses. The genuine concern for Olivia's recovery, the discomfort with witnessing suffering he could not immediately resolve through financial intervention, the unfamiliar experience of being just another worried person in a crowded waiting room rather than the most powerful individual in any given space. Morning brought cautious optimism from the medical team. Olivia's fever reducing incrementally her oxygen levels, stabilizing the aggressive treatment, showing initial positive response. The attending physician's explanation included a comment that lodged in Victor's awareness with particular weight: the black mold exposure likely created vulnerability to this infection. Once she's stable, you'll need to address that environmental factor before she returns home. The statement delivered as routine medical advice, without knowledge of the circumstances connected directly to Victor's growing recognition of his indirect responsibility for the family's housing situation. As Gabby focused entirely on her daughter's care, Victor stepped into the hospital corridor to make a call that would have been inconceivable 24 hours earlier. "This is Victor Harrington. I need immediate investigation into Westside Properties Management, specifically their maintenance practices at the Parkview Apartments complex. I want full documentation of all tenant complaints, inspection reports, and executive decisions regarding the black mold situation. Yes, I understand it's not normal business hours. This takes priority over everything else on the schedule today." The directive continued with specific instructions for immediate remediation, regardless of cost, documentation of all negligent practices, and identification of personnel responsible for decisions that prioritized profit over tenant safety. The call represented more than standard business oversight. It was acknowledgement of responsibility and commitment to remedy harm that his disconnected ownership had enabled. As Victor ended the call, he noticed Sullivan, a nurse he had observed, interacting respectfully with Gabby, earlier watching him with a complex expression. "You're her mother's employer," the man stated, rather than asked, professional neutrality masking whatever judgment might lie beneath. "Yes. The family is staying temporarily in my staff quarters while their apartment is remediated." The explanation felt hollow, even as Victor offered it, the vast disparity between his circumstances and theirs impossible to justify in this environment where consequences of inequality were so immediately visible. "Gabby Williams is one of the finest nurses I've ever worked with." Sullivan offered his statement carrying clear protective intention toward his colleague. "She's saved countless lives on this floor, often staying hours past her shift without compensation because she refuses to abandon patients in crisis." The information aligned with what Victor had begun to discover about Gabby's character, but carried additional weight coming from a professional peer. Her dedication to her patients is extraordinary, especially considering what she's sacrificed to remain at City General. Sullivan's implied question about Victor's own intentions hung unspoken between them, the protective loyalty of co-workers, creating a barrier that wealth and position couldn't easily penetrate. "I'm beginning to understand that Victor acknowledged the simple admission reflecting genuine recognition rather than strategic response." When he returned to the pediatric unit, he found Gabby maintaining calm, professional demeanor while carefully monitoring her daughter's treatment, the nurse's knowledge allowing her to interpret vital signs and medication responses with expertise that complemented rather than challenged the attending medical team. Her colleagues treated her with a respect that transcended hierarchical position, consulting her observations and accommodating her dual role as mother and healthcare professional. The visible expressions of community support, staff bringing coffee without being asked, colleagues stopping by during breaks to offer encouragement, supervisors rearranging schedules to accommodate her unexpected absence, demonstrated a relational infrastructure entirely different from the transactional interactions that characterized Victor's professional existence. By late morning, Olivia had stabilized enough for longer-term planning. The attending physician's discharge instructions included explicit warnings about returning to an environment with mold exposure, a medical directive that connected directly to Victor's growing sense of responsibility for addressing the conditions that had contributed to her illness. "We'll need to find alternative accommodation until the remediation is complete." Gabby was explaining to Esther the practical challenge evident in her expression. "Maybe Janice could take us for a few days until I can figure something out." Before conscious deliberation, Victor found himself offering, "You're welcome to remain in the staff quarters as long as necessary. There's plenty of space, and it would allow Olivia to recover in a consistent environment." The offer emerged without calculated purpose, driven by genuine concern rather than strategic positioning or guilt-motivated charity. Gabby's momentary surprise gave way to practical assessment, her daughter's well-being outweighing pride or discomfort with accepting help. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. That would be extremely helpful until our apartment is safe." The simple exchange, devoid of the power dynamics that typically characterized his interactions, created another moment of unexpected authenticity. As they prepared for Olivia's continued hospitalization, Victor found himself making an uncharacteristic promise. "I'll personally ensure your building's remediation is handled properly and thoroughly." What happened with the delayed response was unacceptable. The commitment represented more than standard business oversight. It was acknowledgement of a connection between his business practices and human consequences he had previously treated as abstract externalities. The night spent in uncomfortable waiting room chairs, witnessing both suffering and compassion beyond his insulated experience, had shifted something fundamental in Victor's perception. The businessman who had built an empire on strategic calculation found himself responding to human need without measuring potential return, an unfamiliar but not entirely forgotten way of engaging with the world that predated his prior accumulation of wealth and power. 1 week later, Olivia reclined on a chaise longue in what had previously been Victor's rarely used sitting room, now transformed into a comfortable recovery space with natural light, appropriate entertainment, and easy access to the entertainment kitchen. The room's conversion had occurred during her hospitalization, Victor directing staff to create an environment conducive to healing with the same decisive efficiency he typically reserved for business acquisitions. Bookshelves had been filled with selections matching her interests, educational games, and a new tablet provided distraction during necessary rest periods, and the formal furniture replaced with more comfortable pieces that accommodated her need for frequent position changes as her lungs continued healing. Gabby divided her time between her daughter's care and reduced hospital shifts, her cautious acceptance of Victor's assistance reflecting pragmatic necessity rather than comfortable trust. The arrangement remained temporary in her mind, accepting help during crisis different from relying on charity as solution, but her daughter's health outweighed considerations of pride or independence. For Victor, the week had brought changes extending far beyond household arrangements. The investigation into his property management subsidiary had revealed systematic negligence far exceeding his initial suspicions, maintenance requests ignored across multiple properties, safety inspections, falsified corners cut to maximize profit margins, while tenants lived with increasingly dangerous conditions. The executives responsible had presented these practices as cost optimization strategies in quarterly reports, the human consequences concealed behind financial terminology that prioritized profit over safety. The meeting with these executives had been unlike any in Victor's corporate history. Rather than focusing on numerical outcomes, he had arrived with detailed documentation of specific tenant complaints, photographs of substandard conditions, and medical records connecting these environments to health consequences for praises, partivers, and of SOV residents. Explained to me, he had demanded, spreading evidence across the conference table, how ignoring a black mold problem for 9 months constitutes acceptable business practice under any definition. The executive's shock at his focus on tenant welfare rather than financial performance had revealed how completely they had internalized his previous priorities. Their attempts to justify decisions through profitability metrics and market comparisons, strategies that would have satisfied him months earlier, now struck him as morally bankrupt rationalizations for exploitation. "I don't care about the industry standard if the standard itself is fundamentally wrong," he had interrupted their explanations. "These are human beings living in properties we own and manage. Their safety isn't an optional consideration or a line item to be minimized." The confrontation had ended with immediate personnel changes, comprehensive policy revisions, and directives for remediation of all identified health hazards, regardless of cost impact. Victor's demand for accountability had extended beyond this single subsidiary to include comprehensive audit of all his business holdings for similar ethical failures, a process that promised to uncover uncomfortable truths about how his fortune had been built and maintained. This corporate reckoning paralleled a more personal one occurring within his household. The conversation with Esther had been particularly uncomfortable. 15 years of subtle disrespect and suspicion difficult to acknowledge directly. "I owe you an apology, Esther." He had begun awkwardly one evening, finding her preparing for the next day in the kitchen. "For what specifically, Mr. Harrington?" Her question contained neither accusation nor absolution, simply a dignified request for clarity, for never fully acknowledging your competence and integrity, for the constant surveillance and testing, for the assumption that you must be dishonest simply because he had faltered there, the explicit acknowledgement of his racial bias, difficult to articulate even as he recognized its reality. "Simply because I'm Black." Esther had completed the sentence with the directness of someone who had navigated such biases for decades. Her tone held no bitterness but no pretense either, just the clear-eyed perspective of someone who had observed his prejudice without the luxury of ignoring its existence. Yes, Victor had admitted the simple acknowledgement more difficult than complex financial negotiations. "That and other assumptions I made without evidence or justification." Esther had nodded, neither rushing to forgive nor holding obvious resentment. "Thank you for saying so directly. That's relatively rare in my experience." After a thoughtful pause, she had added, "May I ask what prompted this recognition?" The question invited reflection rather than defensiveness. "Your granddaughter Victor had answered honestly, her integrity when tested. And then seeing your family's interactions, your daughter's work, the contrast between your circumstances and choices, and what I would have predicted based on my assumptions." Esther's slight smile had acknowledged the irony, without requiring him to belabor it. Children often see and show truth more clearly than adults, she had observed. Olivia has always had a special gift for that. The conversation had shifted to more practical matters, but its impact lingered. The beginning of a relationship based on mutual respect rather than power differential and suspicion. Later that same evening, alone in his study with mounting evidence of how his business practices had harmed vulnerable communities, Victor had found himself asking the question that had been forming since Olivia's first unexpected break: honesty. "Have I been a racist, Esther?" The bluntness of the question had reflected genuine desire to understand rather than seek absolution. Esther's measured response had acknowledged complexity while refusing comfortable evasion. "Racism isn't always about conscious hatred, Mr. Harrington. It's often about systems that benefit some while harming others, about assumptions we don't examine about who we see as fully human and deserving of dignity. By those measures, yes, some of your actions and systems have perpetuated racial inequity, whether that was your intention or not." The uncomfortable truth had prompted late-night research, Victor using the same analytical skills previously devoted to profit maximization to understand racial wealth gaps, housing discrimination, and health disparities. The data had confirmed what Esther's lived experience already knew. His business practices had often reinforced systemic inequalities, while his personal biases remained unexamined behind a facade of colorblind meritocracy that ignored unequal starting points and ongoing barriers. This reckoning extended to his direct conversation with Gabby about her apartment situation, a discussion that acknowledged responsibility rather than offering charity. "I want to be direct about something," he had begun during a rare moment when they were alone. Olivia resting after physical therapy exercises. "The black mold in your building was the responsibility of a property management company I own. The delayed response that endangered your family's health happened because executives prioritized profit over safety, with my implicit approval through inattention." Gabby's expression had shifted from surprise to controlled anger, not the resentful envy he might once have expected, but the righteous indignation of a mother whose child had suffered preventable harm. "So your company is the reason my daughter developed pneumonia, the reason we had to leave our home, the reason she missed weeks of school." Each question had landed with deserved force, her dignity undiminished by their power differential. Yes, Victor had acknowledged, accepting responsibility without deflection. "I can't undo that harm, but I am addressing it systemically, both for your building specifically and across all properties. And I want to cover all medical expenses related to Olivia's illness without it being charity, but as recognition of responsibility." The offer had created visible tension for Gabby, the practical necessity of accepting help balanced against pride and the desire for independence. "I don't want special treatment because my mother happens to work for you," she had stated firmly. "Other families in our building have suffered too without having that connection." "You're right," Victor had agreed immediately. "The remediation will address all units, and we're establishing a health impact fund for affected residents to cover medical costs and temporary relocation expenses." Your situation highlighted systemic problems that hurt many families, not just yours. The commitment to structural changes rather than individualized charity had shifted the conversation from personal favor to systematic responsibility. While reluctance had remained visible in Gabby's expression, practical necessity had ultimately outweighed pride. "For Olivia's sake, I accept the help with medical expenses. But I pay my own way forward once this situation is resolved." The boundary had been clear and appropriate, accepting responsibility for harm while maintaining independence moving forward. This conversation, like others during this period of reckoning, had given Victor something his wealth couldn't purchase: a mirror reflecting his actions and systems with unflinching clarity, while offering the possibility of genuine growth rather than transactional absolution. As the days passed and Olivia's health gradually improved, Victor found himself making a decision that would alter the trajectory of his business empire and personal legacy. The transformation wasn't instantaneous or without struggle. Decades of entrenched patterns couldn't be reversed through single moments of insight, but the direction had fundamentally shifted. The billionaire who had built his fortune through ruthless acquisition and profit maximization began systematically examining how his business practices affected actual human lives beyond abstract metrics of shareholder value. The man who had constructed elaborate tests to confirm his cynical expectations now found himself equally committed to creating systems that enabled dignity and fairness rather than exploitation and inequality. This personal and professional reckoning emerged not from external pressure or public relations considerations, but from the uncomfortable recognition that his approach to business and human relationships had created harm he could no longer ignore or justify. A recognition catalyzed by a child's simple honesty that had revealed his own moral bankruptcy more clearly than balance sheets ever could. 3 months after Olivia's hospitalization, changes, both subtle and profound, had reshaped Victor's home and business enterprises. The mansion itself felt different, no longer a showcase of wealth rarely used by its solitary owner, but a space where genuine interaction occurred with increasing frequency. The library had become a regular evening destination, where Victor and Olivia discussed books and ideas, the child's natural curiosity drawing out knowledge and perspectives Victor had rarely shared. The formal dining room, previously used only for occasional business, entertaining now hosted weekly family-style dinners where conversation flowed more naturally than in any social gathering Victor had experienced in decades. The most visible change had occurred in Victor himself. Not in dramatic personality transformation, but in the gradual softening of calcified patterns and emergence of qualities long suppressed beneath defensive cynicism. His executive team struggled to adapt to his new priorities and ethical concerns, particularly those who had advanced through alignment with his previous focus on profit maximization, regardless of social impact. The comprehensive audit of all his business holdings for ethical practices had revealed uncomfortable truths about how much of his fortune had been built on exploitation rather than value creation. "I don't understand this new direction," his longtime CFO had complained during a particularly tense board meeting. "We've always operated within legal parameters. These ethical considerations are subjective and unmeasurable." Victor's response had reflected his evolving perspective without abandoning analytical rigor. Legal compliance is the minimum standard, not the benchmark for ethical business. And while some factors may be subjective, their impacts are quantifiable: employee well-being, community health outcomes, environmental sustainability. These metrics matter because they reflect real consequences for actual human beings, not just abstract entities on balance sheets. The creation of the Harrington Foundation had formalized this shift in priorities. establishing an organization focused specifically on affordable housing and healthcare access with substantial funding and strategic vision rather than superficial, charitable giving, designed primarily for tax advantages. The foundation's structure reflected Victor's business acumen while serving fundamentally different objectives than pure profit generation. His first visit to Gabby's workplace had been particularly revealing, seeing firsthand the conditions at City General Hospital rather than abstractly knowing about healthcare disparities. Walking through crowded corridors where dedicated professionals provided care despite inadequate resources, Victor had witnessed the daily reality Gabby navigated with such commitment. The stark contrast between these conditions and the private medical care he took for granted had created uncomfortable awareness of how wealth insulated him from realities others couldn't escape. The meeting with hospital administration had begun as fact-finding but evolved into specific commitments. Your oncology ward is severely understaffed and using equipment at least a decade outdated, Victor had observed to the hospital director. The limitations aren't from lack of dedicated personnel, but from systemic underfunding. The director's weary acknowledgement had confirmed his assessment. We've been advocating for increased budgets for years, but public funding continues declining while patient needs increase. Our staff performs minor miracles daily with what they have available. Victor's offer had emerged without the calculated public relations considerations that typically accompanied his philanthropic gestures. The Harrington Foundation would like to fund a complete equipment upgrade for your oncology department with particular focus on the pediatric wing, and establish an endowment for staffing support that would allow competitive salaries to retain your excellent nurses like Gabby Williams. The offer had been substantial enough to visibly shock the administrator, who had responded with appropriate skepticism about potential strings attached. That's extremely generous, but we'd need to understand any conditions associated with such funding. Just one, Victor had replied. That the care remains accessible to all patients regardless of insurance status or ability to pay. This isn't about naming rights or publicity. It's about addressing a need I've personally witnessed. This commitment had emerged from a revelation about Olivia that had deepened his respect for Gabby's choices and character. During a conversation about the child's interest in medicine, he had learned that Olivia's passion stemmed from her own experience as a cancer patient at age 3, a battle with leukemia that had inspired both her career, aspirations, and her mother's decision to specialize in oncology nursing. The experimental treatment that saved her was financially devastating. Esther had explained when Olivia wasn't present. Gabby is still paying those medical debts 7 years later, but she says every payment is a celebration that her daughter is alive to need new shoes and school supplies. This personal connection to healthcare inequity had transformed Victor's understanding from abstract awareness to emotional recognition. The systems he had previously accepted or even benefited from suddenly revealed as barriers to basic human dignity and survival. His growing understanding of these interconnected injustices had led to direct involvement in the renovation of Gabby's apartment building, not as distant investor but as engaged participant in community improvement. The project had expanded beyond basic remediation to comprehensive upgrading of facilities, safety features, and common areas for all residents. The initial suspicion from tenants, understandably wary of a billionaire's sudden interest in their living conditions, had gradually shifted toward cautious appreciation as promised improvements materialized without accompanying rent increases or displacement. Victor's first community meeting in the building he owned, but had never visited, had been profoundly uncomfortable, facing directly the people whose living conditions his business decisions had impacted. Rather than presenting predetermined solutions or expecting gratitude for his intervention, he had done something entirely foreign to his previous approach. He had listened. Residents had shared experiences of maintenance requests, ignored health concerns, dismissed and basic dignity denied through neglectful management. Their perspectives had provided insights no executive summary could capture, the lived reality of how abstract business decisions created concrete suffering for families already navigating economic precarity. "I can't undo the harm that's already occurred," Victor had acknowledged to the gathered residents. But I can commit to fundamental changes in how these properties are managed, moving forward with your needs and perspectives included in decisions that affect your homes. The transformative experience of using his resources to address actual human needs rather than accumulate additional wealth for its own sake had altered something fundamental in Victor's understanding of purpose and success. This shift had not gone unnoticed by those closest to the situation. "You're becoming a different person, Mr. Harrington," Gabby had observed one evening after witnessing his interaction with community organizers developing tenant advocacy programs across his properties. The observation had contained neither flattery nor judgment, simply recognition of evident change. "I'm becoming the person I should have been all along," Victor had responded with uncharacteristic candor. "Your family helped me see that." The acknowledgement had come without calculation or expectation. Simple recognition that the Williams family had given him something his wealth couldn't purchase, reconnection to values and humanity he had sacrificed in pursuit of. Financial success divorced from purpose beyond accumulation. This transformation remained incomplete and ongoing. Decades of entrenched patterns couldn't be reversed through single moments of insight or declaration. Victor still struggled with implicit biases, still found himself calculating advantage in certain situations, still faced resistance from business associates invested in previous priorities. But the direction had fundamentally shifted with each decision, and interaction providing opportunity to align actions with emerging values rather than default to comfortable patterns of the past. The businessman who had once set elaborate tests to confirm his cynical expectations of humanity now found himself equally committed to creating systems that assumed and enabled basic dignity, not from naive idealism, but from recognition that his previous approach had created harm he could no longer justify or ignore. This transformation had begun with a child's simple honesty, catalyzed by a family's integrity, despite challenging circumstances, and continued through deliberate choices to align business practices with human values rather than abstract profit maximization. The journey remained unfinished, but its trajectory had been irrevocably altered by the recognition that genuine wealth might be measured in meaningful connection rather than financial accumulation. 1 year after the night, Olivia had found the $100 bill near his safe. Victor Harrington's life and business approach had undergone transformation that few who knew him previously would have believed possible. The Harrington Foundation had established itself as a significant force for affordable housing and healthcare access, with impact extending far beyond symbolic philanthropy into structural change initiatives. Rather than operating as separate charitable entity disconnected from core business practices, the Foundation's principles had progressively integrated into Victor's corporate governance, creating radical restructuring that prioritized ethical practices alongside financial sustainability. Quarterly reviews now included social impact assessments alongside profit metrics, executive compensation, tied partially to community benefit outcomes, rather than solely financial performance. The transformation had not come without resistance. Shareholders, accustomed to prioritizing maximum short-term returns, had initially objected to decisions that balanced profit with ethical considerations. Several board members had resigned in protest when Victor refused to approve development projects that would have generated substantial returns through community displacement. Industry peers had dismissed his evolving approach as temporary aberration or publicity stunt, rather than genuine shift in business philosophy. Yet the results had gradually silenced many critics. Properties, under new management practices, showed decreased tenant turnover, reduced maintenance costs through preventative care, and stronger community engagement, factors that improved long-term financial performance even as they place expersons, prioritized resident well-being. Companies throughout his portfolio, implementing living wages and improved working conditions, demonstrated increased productivity, reduced training costs, and enhanced brand reputation that translated to sustainable growth. The City General Hospital renovation had progressed from initial equipment upgrades to comprehensive transformation of an entire wing, eventually named not after Victor as hospital administrators had suggested, but in honor of Olivia and other pediatric cancer survivors. Gabby's promotion to Director of Nursing had come through peer recognition of her exceptional leadership abilities, her new role enabling implementation of innovative care programs she had envisioned but previously lacked resources to develop. Esther had finally accepted retirement with full benefits and comprehensive healthcare coverage, though she still visited regularly, now as friend and family rather than employee. Her wisdom continued influencing Victor's evolving understanding of systemic inequities, her lived experience providing perspective his privileged position could never fully comprehend independently. Olivia's academic development had flourished, her natural intelligence nurtured through educational opportunities. Victor established not as personal favor, but through systematic scholarship programs, supporting promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Their regular discussions about books, science, and her future medical ambitions had evolved into relationship resembling what Victor imagined grandfatherhood might feel like. Genuine investment in potential balanced with respect for independent development. The relationship had partially filled the void created by estrangement from his own adult children, though their recent tentative reconnection suggested possibility for healing even those long-damaged bonds. Victor's sprawling mansion had gradually transformed from imposing showplace into functional home where comfort outweighed impression. Formal spaces previously maintained for hypothetical entertaining had been repurposed for actual living, library expanded with comfortable reading nooks, dining room reconfigured for conversation rather than status display grounds made, accessible for community events rather than isolated behind imposing barriers. Regular family dinners, including Esther, Gabby, and Olivia, had become anchoring ritual in Victor's weekly schedule, genuine connection replacing the isolated meals that had previously punctuated endless work hours. The contrast between his former isolation and current community had revealed how thoroughly he had confused wealth with well-being, accumulation with accomplishment. The media had inevitably noticed these changes, business publications questioning the Harrington transformation from cutthroat tycoon to ethical business leader, profile writers, seeking explanation for apparent character evolution in Quoter, someone previously known for ruthless consistency. Victor's responses to these inquiries had reflected uncomfortable honesty rather than crafted narrative. I spent decades accumulating wealth while systematically eliminating what actually matters: connection, purpose, contribution to others' well-being, he acknowledged in one particularly revealing interview. It took a child's integrity to show me how thoroughly I had confused financial success with actual living. The recognition of how completely the Williams family had transformed his understanding extended beyond public statements into private reflection and concrete action. His conversation with Gabby on the anniversary of Olivia's illness had attempted to articulate this impact without reducing it to sentimental platitude. "Your family changed everything for me," he had acknowledged as they watched Olivia practicing presentation for school science fair. "Not through trying to influence me, but by simply being who you are. People of integrity, even when that's the harder path." Gabby's response had acknowledged his growth while maintaining appropriate perspective. Everyone has capacity for change when they're willing to see others as fully human. You could have doubled down on your biases instead of examining them. That choice was yours. The observation had recognized his agency in the transformation, while honoring the catalyst that her family had provided, balance that neither absolved him of responsibility nor denied him credit for difficult growth. This conversation had preceded Victor's announcement of significant decision regarding his estate, restructuring his will to establish trust designed to continue ethical business approach and philanthropic work beyond his Proust lifetime. The trust's governance structure incorporated both financial expertise and community perspective, ensuring decisions would balance business sustainability with human impact rather than defaulting to profit maximization alone. His inclusion of Gabby on the board of trustees acknowledged the value of her perspective and integrity. recognition of wisdom that came from lived experience rather than financial credentials alone. The educational trust established for Olivia and other promising students from disadvantaged backgrounds represented investment in potential that extended beyond individual relationship to systematic opportunity creation. The final element completing this year of transformation came during Olivia's school presentation about people who change their communities, project examining how individuals impact collective well-being through values-driven action. Victor had attended at Olivia's invitation, expecting to observe from background as one among many supportive adults. Her inclusion of him among her examples had therefore caught him entirely unprepared. Her simple description of how Mr. Harrington changed his business to help people have safe homes and better health care presented without the complicated context adults might have emphasized. When her teacher asked what lesson could be learned from these community changemakers, Olivia's response had captured essential truth with characteristic directness, that people can grow and change when they decide what really matters. And that character is what you do when nobody's watching. The phrase, identical to his father's wisdom to Malcolm's reminder to Esther's teaching, had completed circle that began with small test designed to confirm cynical expectations and instead revealed path toward reclaiming humanity he had sacrificed in pursuit of wealth without purpose. Victor's journey from isolated billionaire to connected community member remained incomplete. 1 year could not fully transform patterns established over decades. But the direction had fundamentally altered, with each decision providing opportunity to align actions with values rather than default to comfortable patterns of the past. The businessman who had built empire through strategic calculation now found himself equally invested in creating legacy, measured through human flourishing rather than financial accumulation alone. This transformation had begun with child's simple honesty, catalyzed by family's integrity, despite challenging circumstances, and continued through deliberate choices, prioritizing connection over accumulation, contribution over accumulation contribution. Conquest. The ultimate test of this evolution would be its sustainability beyond emotional response into systematic approach to business and relationship, legacy. Defined not by buildings bearing his name, but by lives improved through structural changes his influence had enabled. Have you ever witnessed how one small interaction can completely change someone's life path? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of transformation and breaking down prejudice resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about human connection and growth. How has a child's perspective ever changed how you see the world? Remember that sometimes our greatest teachers come in the most unexpected packages. Thank you for joining us on Victor's journey, from cynicism to compassion, from isolation to family. May we all remain open to the lessons that challenge our assumptions and help us become better versions of ourselves. Please share this video with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to change, to grow, and to build a more meaningful legacy than wealth alone. Victor Harrington's story reveals how wealth can isolate us from our humanity when accumulation becomes our sole purpose. His transformation shows that it's never too late to reconnect with values we've abandoned in pursuit of success. Though prejudice had become an unexamined part of Victor's worldview, a child's simple honesty cracked open his cynicism, proving that our biases often say more about us than those we judge. The contrast between Victor's material wealth and the Williams family's rich connections highlights that true prosperity lies in our relationships and purpose. Esther, Gabby, and Olivia demonstrated dignity and integrity, not because they expected reward, but because their character remained consistent whether observed or not. This narrative reminds us that systems of inequity persist when those with power remain disconnected from their human consequences. Victor's transformation began when he stopped seeing poverty as a moral failure and recognized how his business practices contributed to others' struggles. Perhaps most importantly, the story shows that meaningful change requires more than charitable gestures. It demands reimagining success itself. Victor's greatest accomplishment wasn't building his fortune, but redirecting it toward human flourishing rather than mere accumulation. The journey from cynicism to compassion is never complete, but each step toward seeing others' full humanity moves us closer to our own. Has a child's perspective ever changed how you view the world? Share your experience in the comments below. If you've ever witnessed how prejudice can blind us to people's true character, or how a single act of integrity can transform someone's heart, hit that like button to spread this message. Has wealth or status ever isolated you from meaningful connections? Or have you, like Victor, discovered that true richness comes from relationships rather than possessions? Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about transformation and human connection. If you know someone struggling to find purpose beyond success, please share this video with them. It might be exactly what they need to hear. Thank you for joining us on this journey, from isolation to community, from cynicism to hope. May we all find the courage to question our assumptions and the wisdom to value character over status in our own lives.